Hello, my name is Shannon Studden, and I am a Senior Program Specialist with the National Rural Health Resource Center, which we also call the Center. I'd like to welcome you to the Advanced Nursing Education Workforce, or a new webinar series on transitioning to practice. This series is offered by the National Rural Health Resource Center through an agreement with the College of St. Scholastica and funded through the ANU grant offered through the Bureau of Health Workforce within the Health Resources and Services Administration. The goal of this series is to provide advanced practice nursing students and recent graduates from the College of St. Scholastica's Rural Academic Practice Partnership, our new program, with tools and strategies to help smooth your transition into practice. In this webinar, we're focusing on self-care and resiliency. When we here at the center and our partners at St. Scholastica were having discussions to choose the topics that we thought would be most meaningful for you as advanced practice nursing students who are about to launch into practice, the topics of self-care and resiliency immediately bubbled to the top. We know that nurses and nurse practitioners are often really good at focusing on and caring for others, but sometimes may not give as high a priority as they could to caring for themselves. We also know that patient care requires a lot of emotional investment, and we know that when practitioners give themselves space to care for their own physical, emotional, and spiritual health, everybody really benefits. So once we chose the topic of self-care and resiliency, we also knew immediately who we wanted to serve as our subject matter expert for this webinar, and that is my former colleague here at the center, Cami Norland. We were really excited when she agreed to join us today. So I'll tell you a little bit about Cami. She is now the CEO of Integrative Resources, an organization that uses brain health to enhance the value of workplaces. Cami has over 20 years of experience in healthcare. She's worked with state and federal governments, rural health clinics, networks, hospitals, medical schools, and has developed successful multi-state and federal wellness initiatives. She began her career providing psychotherapy at an outpatient mental health center. She educates on how to integrate resilience practices in the workplace and is a registered art therapist. She's also a recovering overachiever. So welcome, Cami. We are really glad you're here.
Thank you.
So Cami, the focus of this session is on nursing students transitioning into practice, and this can be a really stressful but also really exciting change in one's life. So when you think back to your days as a therapist, what was your experience like when you transitioned into practice?
Yes, thank you. Like so many of the listeners of this session, you've gotten to this point where you've had tremendous success academically, achieving what fewer than 1% of the nursing population in the US has achieved. So congratulations for that. But this also means that you're very likely guilty of the same fate as myself of being an overachiever and aiming for perfection and fortunately, most often obtaining it, or close as one can get to that. But this perspective comes with many perks and we're rewarded for it, but overachievers love that and it reinforces our awesomeness, right? uh, but it does have that downside and that's a little bit of that dark side as well, which means that because you care so much and you do everything you can to give it your all, you're also statistically more likely to experience greater levels of cognitive dissonance as you start to transition into practice. Mainly because you want to uphold those expectations that have been set for you, but I think more so it's the expectations that you've set for yourself, which are likely pretty high or perhaps even unattainable, and that can get us into some struggles. So when I first transitioned from grad school into practice at the outpatient mental health center, I was set out to change the world. I had my superhero cape on, I was armed with optimism and frankly a bit of naivete, even though I felt I was savvy to the real world of clinical care outside of academia, but I quickly realized I wasn't. I wasn't as prepared as I could have been. I knew so much about theory that I needed to really rely on and trust that the education that I had obtained was enough and that it had prepared me enough. Even though I was a straight A student and I test well and I know I'm kind, and so I had the confidence that I thought I could get through anything, but there were a few moments that school could just not prepare me enough for. One of those situations was as a working in the mental health world, we were charged with operating the crisis line, particularly for those at risk of suicide. And this was for the whole county. And the average number of calls in an evening was 3. However, the first time I got on the crisis line, and this was back in the days when we had everybody, you'd work from home and you'd have a cell phone, and you would do this over the weekend, over an evening. And the first night, remember there was 3 on average, I had 27 calls my first evening, and 1 completed suicide. There is no training that school can prepare you for to be there at that last moment when somebody is reaching out to you with their last breath, asking for help, and you can't do it. You can't do much about it. Sure, I followed all of the protocols that had been set in place. It still rattles you that first time you experience death on the workplace. And the calls just kept proceeding after that throughout the evening. And the next morning when I get to work, I've got these pile of reports that I'm handing in to my supervisor, sharing all that had happened throughout my experience. And the reaction that I received was, high five, you've now earned your stripes. Laughter that, oh my word, we told our clients, our patients to give you a call and make sure to see if you're up for the challenge. Henceforth, the high volume. It was something that I hadn't anticipated, being the youngest individual on the team of providers. And so it was a bit concerning, a bit rattling to experience this workplace culture that was filled with, now I see, really burned out individuals. It was a culture that had an us versus them mentality. And it was a struggle for me to try and figure out part of not only these dynamics, but figure out that departmental culture. Like any new kid on the block, trying to figure out, how do you stand out, but also fit in? As I started to, a few months, days passed, I started noticing some of these other instances that I wasn't prepared for from school, such as the value misalignment that I had observed within the medical system, particularly around the stigma associated with mental illness that I saw the patients that I was seeing were experiencing, not only from individuals in the clinic, but when they would go into the medical system, the clinics. And I also noticed a lot of incongruencies. For instance, in another role, I was speaking with a director of nursing who revealed that she loaded up a patient with his precious 2 liters of Mountain Dew because per his request, because he had he was just loved it so much, despite the fact that he had had a diabetic amputation. But she said that she does this to help support her patients, and she wanted to provide that extra mile so they could improve their quality patient scores. So for me, it was this challenge of what's the right thing, living in that gray area of what are my values, what are the values of the organization, and how do we navigate those nuances that we may not be as aware of as students, but when we're transitioning into practice, you start to see some of these thorns of incongruencies. Another instance that comes to mind was being, well, frankly, just being prepared and being a part of somebody's grief, loss, and trauma at such intense levels. It was challenging to navigate between being a human and caring for someone, and also that line of professionalism of moving to the next patient with a clean slate. And that led to, and I think we see that a lot in nursing, where you spend 15 minutes with one patient and you experience their intense highs, their intense lows, and you have to quickly shut that down and move to the next patient. And that led to a cycle of sleep deprivation due to exhaustion that led to over-caffeinating, which I think is a common response that a lot of us have when we're experiencing that mental, emotional, even frankly, spiritual fatigue from some of these situations. And that creates that burnout. And when I became burned out, I finally fit in with my colleagues, which is then when I knew I needed to leave direct care and put on my cape yet again and try to change some of these system level barriers at the national level, which I feel I did and am continuing to do through my work with integrative resources.
Wow, thanks, Cami. So I heard you say that there are things school just can't prepare you for as you transition to practice, and that maybe resetting that expectation as students move into practice and leave the university. But just to not have such a high expectation for themselves that they'll be prepared for anything. But are there things that they can do outside of just their clinical knowledge that can help them be prepared and confident as they move into into transition to practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you're at this stage of being able to transition into practice, you have intellectually prepared as much as you can. And so now it's time to focus on preparing emotionally, physically, spiritually, and perhaps financially as well. And I think it all begins with managing that pesky brain that's designed to keep us alive, which is really that largest barrier you'll likely to encounter. It's that naysayer in your voice. It's one of those that harshest critic that we have that's always saying mean things in our head. And that really is known as your survival instinct. That naysayer voice is based on situations that you have based on insecurities and vulnerabilities that you have experienced throughout your life, that's trying to prepare you to avoid those situations. So we get that, then we have that survival instinct, that fight or flight response, and how we can respond when a stressful situation comes in. But the goal is to notice when that naysayer voice starts jabbing at you and either shut it down or reframe it as quickly as possible. So I think that's the hallmark of resilience is it doesn't matter what happens to you. What matters is how you respond. And that response shapes your brain. It shapes how your brain is wired. It shapes the way that you carry your body and your posture. When you're stressed, we tend to, raise up our shoulders and tighten up our jaw. We have all of these physical cues that indicate that we're experiencing a level of stress. It also impacts our breath, where when we are experiencing stress, we tend to breathe through our chest and not so much through our belly. And our breath becomes shallow and short versus long and deep. You start to notice behavior of, if you're either you're fighting, you're yelling at somebody, or if you're calm and cool and collected. And that influences who you hang around with too. And that's based on, could be your colleagues, it could be the patients that you're with. All of these things influence how you respond to stress. So a little bit about what's happening when you are experiencing a stressful event. So take a look at this slide. As you can tell, I like I like bees. So what happens when you're stressed? The stressful event comes in and it triggers that amygdala. We take a look where it's all lit up in red, and all of these situations of AIDS are happening in a split-second response where you start to feel out of control, and that reduces your prefrontal cortex activity, which then means that you have difficulties making even minor decisions. We've all been there where a situation happens and you think, I don't know what to do next. And you have that moment of panic and you can't decide what to do. Little inside tip, sometimes that decision making also slows down. Say if you're at a restaurant and you have a hard time deciding what to eat, that's evidence that you're still in that fight or flight mode. So just noticing some of these indicators. So difficulties making decisions, having the same response of fight or flight or freeze. Again, you start to notice that your chest, you're breathing out of your chest and not your belly. Your thigh muscles start to tighten. Your blood pressure raises. You create turbulence on those blood vessel walls, which creates breakage, scar tissue, inflammation. This leads to chronic disease, that inflammation, and that creates then habits that are reinforced in our brain, telling us that situation, when I responded with a fight or flight response to this particular stressor, I was rewarded. I start to experience cravings, or I start to medicate and drink more caffeine. In my case, I love chocolate cake. I go for my chocolate cake. And we have those same responses time and again. So it's when you start to really put this lens onto the experience that people are having when they're stressed, when a stressful event occurs, it's really helpful to say that response is clearly a fight or flight response. And that's helpful. So what is one thing that leads to that moment of stress is really identifying the root cause. And when you take a look at all of these situations and what boils down into those root causes of distress, and so these are some of those indicators that you may be able to see in yourself in your colleagues or in your patients, it's that lack of control. You know, there's when you're seeing that there's nothing you can do about a situation, but watch a person suffer, and a plan or expectations, or when expectations fail. It's that demand resource imbalance when you feel like you've got too much to do in too little time. And this is particularly a symptom that happens in workplaces. And this leads to fatigue, this leads to lost productivity, this leads to that wandering mind where we have a really hard time organizing and prioritizing what we can do about a situation. And with that lack of prioritization, we start to see us spending as much time on a menial task as we would on a very large task, or vice versa. We spend a very little amount of time on something that values to us a lot, but what we have control over, we tend to focus on. So that can result in that demand resource imbalance and that wandering mind. Lack of purpose and meaning. This happens a lot when we're not staying true to ourselves, or when we start to see some of those instances of injustices or inequities that I described earlier. It's instances of the workplace saying one thing, but doing another. And that sense of lack of accountability on that behalf that can really make someone question if they're doing the right work, if they're doing what they're meant to be doing, if they're finding the purpose in their work every day. And if you aren't, that can really weigh heavy on somebody's shoulders. And when you are going through all of these root causes of stress, and when you're experiencing a combination of each of these, then you really start to feel isolated. And that isolation is one of the greatest mammalian pains, is when we feel like we don't have that sense of social support. We're social creatures by nature. We want to belong. We want to be a part of something greater than ourselves. And so it's challenging to, when you are in that space of feeling isolated. So as you start to transition into practice, I think you'll likely witness some of these signs in your colleagues or yourself when you're feeling burned out. You'll start to see, maybe you'll start to disconnect from one another. You may start to see the us versus them culture come about when you start seeing depersonalization and judgment towards patients, towards colleagues, towards whomever. I think one of the clear signals is that we have such a culture of being stressed, less so now in this COVID era, but when people are asked, "How are you?" and they respond, "Busy." For me, that says, oh, they must be experiencing a level of stress. If they're always working, if they're always doing some busyness, their mind must be wandering and not being able to get that break. You may start to see some physical cues of somebody experiencing individual stress, where again, you'll see shoulders reach up, you'll see jaws start to tighten, you'll start to see, people will lean forward. Their physical body will indicate that they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, on their back. And so these are some of the signs that you can assess. And your workplace has a greater impact on your health than your primary care provider. You're going to be at work more than 40 plus hours a week. So who you surround yourself with, the environment, the people, if they're happy and supportive, that really contributes to your health and your productivity and how you respond and engage with the world. If they aren't, and it can really be a detriment to your health. And we're seeing that this is really pervasive and serious stuff, as up to 90% of stress leads to chronic disease. There are recent studies from the Centers for Disease Control that 6 out of 10 individuals have a chronic disease. 4 in 10 have multiple chronic disease, and 7 out of 10 are dying from chronic disease. 76% of all physician visits are for treating chronic disease, which means it also says 91% are all prescriptions filled for treating chronic disease, and 99% of Medicare spending is on chronic disease. So this is a lot of, frankly, what your work will be doing is treating chronic disease. And if up to 90% of that is caused by stress, then really focusing on effective management of stress through reframing and some really cool tactics that we all know we just need to integrate into our life.
So thinking about stress and kind of taking it to the next level when it's kind of pervasive and long ranging, there's a lot of talk about just the seriousness of burnout and how physicians and nurses and providers have the highest rate of completed suicides. So what do you attribute this to?
Yes. Well, the cynic in me comes out here a bit, that the US has a tendency to inadvertently blame workers without taking accountability for their own actions. And it's the American way to be individualistic, and therefore we attribute burnout as an individual's problem, an individual that needs to resolve this, an individual that needs to take a hold of their own mental well-being. And yes, there is certainly a truth to that, but we cannot ignore the sociological effects of this. I think that our workplaces need to have a sense of accountability in demonstrating leadership, and we can all demonstrate leadership of caring for one another, operating with compassion. And I like to redefine burnout, meaning that burnout occurs when you're fatigued from all of those root causes of distress. But when you're burned out, that means that there was fire, that you have a passion, that you have the drive. And where there is fire, there are ashes. And from ashes comes growth and renewal. So not being discouraged about experiencing burnout, but rather taking some moment to really lead with compassion But there's some things that people can do when they get to that stage to revert back and grow from their burnout.
So what kinds of things can people do, not only during the transition to practice, but also just as ongoing as in the role of a provider?
Well, I think what you can do to reduce stress is foremost, really relax. Your body is either in survival mode or it's in healing mode. And it can't do both at the same time. So when we get to that state of total relaxation, you know, that moment when when it feels like you're laying on a beach, even though you may not be laying on the beach, of complete bodily relaxation, you have some quiet and peace in your mind. That's the moment when you can really start to heal and problem solve and get to a place of innovation. When you aren't there, we really see that that errors increase, that sleep deprivation and overcaffeination occur. And so when you're on the job, if you want to capture this experience of getting to that state of relaxation, here's an activity. Every 2 hours, you want to take a break for at least 2 minutes. And in those 2 minutes, you want to focus on 3 things: appreciation, and really visualizing, for instance, 3 people that you appreciate, 3 people that have been helpful to you during your day, 3 people that are meaningful to you. So you want to show gratitude or appreciation. You want to demonstrate compassion for yourself. You want to demonstrate compassion for others. Or the third thing that you can do within those 2 minutes is seek out novelty. So novelty is finding something new. It's looking at the world with the curiosity of a 4-year-old, or looking at something in your surroundings, in your office, that you just overlooked and you haven't really studied, and looking at it with an artist's eye. So finding that sense of novelty. And the older we get, the harder it is to obtain novelty, because we've done it all and we've seen it all. And so finding that novelty is really helpful, and starting to rewire your brain out of that fight or flight mode and into the mode of that state of flow, into that mode where we can heal and we can be focused and concentrate. That's the ideal. So every 2 hours, take a break for at least 2 minutes. And the reason why it's every 2 hours is that your brain starts to get fatigued from focusing on whatever task that you're doing. And frankly, in nursing, you're busy multitasking. You've got this multitasking madness going on throughout the entire shift. And so really being intentional for those 2 minutes every 2 hours. I have an alarm that I set for myself that says, focus, do your exercises with gratitude, compassion, or finding novelty. And when you do this exercise, you'll find that your energy level is going to skyrocket, because you are now allowing your brain and your body that time to just relax. So another activity that you can do is to reframe your narrative. Reframe that naysayer in your mind. That's always your harshest critic, the one that is the most sarcastic, the most unkind. We all have it. It's designed to protect us, but it sometimes is not the nicest thing. And it harms our health. So reframing the narrative to always look for the silver lining, find the optimism. What's happening well? How good can it get in this situation? Our brains have a tendency to go to the worst case scenario. And reframing your narrative is finding what's the best thing that could happen in this situation. Another activity that you could do is finding some gratitude triggers. We have so many triggers in the workplace that indicate to us that you need to be stressed. We have clocks, we have, particularly in nursing, we have all of this equipment that may be buzzing, that maybe we're trying to manage. And all of those things can indicate stress. So finding something that triggers a sense of calm, a sense of compassion, a sense of novelty. For instance, I have these stickers that I put everywhere. I put them on my cell phone. I put them on doorknobs. I put them on steering wheels. I put them on places that I know that I may get that sense of that trigger. And so each time I look at this, now I say, okay, now I can just take a moment and breathe and show compassion for whatever is about to happen. So finding whatever that image or that trigger may be for you personally, and putting them in spaces conveniently placed for you to reference throughout your day. Another tactic is to have real conversations. That sounds so silly to even say, but I think we have a lot of superficial conversations with folks, particularly when we don't know them that well. We go through all of the weather banter, the blah, blah, having real conversations with people that are meaningful, that are deep, that really connect and show your authenticity and your compassion and your love for your patients, for your peers, for your mentors, and demonstrating that authenticity with them. The next tactic is that we have been trained as healthcare providers, as Americans, to try and fix anything, fix a problem, find a solution. And sometimes finding a solution or fixing a problem when there is none, particularly around sensitive subjects like death, it is, or an extreme loss or even a minor loss, it's holding space for the individual who's experiencing it, whether it's yourself, whether it's a patient, whether it's a loved one, and holding space for that person to express, have a real conversation, and know that they are safe, that they can be, that they are trusted, and that whatever they're saying doesn't need to be fixed. It's their grief, and their grief just needs to be witnessed, just needs to be held, and it doesn't need to be fixed. This lesson will take you really far in your journey as a nurse, as you'll be experiencing a lot of situations around loss and grief and trauma. And you can't always fix it. So holding space for the patient and their family members in that moment will do wonders in your own health and your own reduction of potential burnout. When you're holding that space, it's good to remember that you're taking on somebody else's burden, somebody else's weight of the world. And to protect yourself from that, making sure that you breathe and breathe with intention. Breathe not from your chest, but breathe from your belly. And I recommend when you breathe, find a pattern where you, for instance, inhale for a count of 6, hold for 4, and exhale for a count of 8. I recommend you go through that breathing exercise right now on your own. And what that does is it centers you, grounds you, and it puts you into a place where you can focus, you can be more compassionate. Stretching and wiggling your stress out of your body at the moment it happens is also really effective. And paying attention and being mindful of your posture and how you're carrying yourself is a really good tactic. I found myself scrunched over sometimes, shoulders up, and wondering, why am I suddenly crabby and agitated? And it's because I've been busy working on my computer, typing away, and something was, a situation was troublesome. And I caught myself. I said, oh, I need to open up, broaden my shoulders, stand up a little taller, return to some good posture. It's amazing what that posture difference can do for an individual. So pay attention for yourself. And when you notice others are demonstrating some of these instances of stress, showing them compassion, maybe that's where they're at. Another tactic that you can do is to financially manage your rewards. As you're transitioning to practice, your income is likely to raise. So congrats to that. But also maintaining your level of priorities and what your values in life are. It's easy to get sucked in to spending sprees or falling into vices of lots of chocolate cake and lots of wine and so being a good fiscal steward of your finances, perhaps budgeting appropriately to pay down student loans, budgeting appropriately for your own comfort level to pay off past debts and prepare for the future, because economic challenges can be really stressful as well. And so managing that, managing your finances based on your values will be important. Another strategy that you can do, I think that the trick is to do a lot of those actions at that moment when the stressful event is triggered, to help strengthen that neural pathway of creative problem solving, as opposed to the fight or flight survival response. And when you're doing that, some of the benefits of transitioning to practice with confidence is exercising what I call the 5 C's of star leadership. So it is leading with compassion. So it's having that ability to look beyond your own suffering, to see the suffering of others. And I think if you're willing to feel everything, then you can do anything. It's also having the courage to do that and not shrinking away from challenges or avoiding conflict. It's demonstrating curiosity. I like to say when a situation that challenges your values or challenges your capacity, but don't get mad, get curious. Get curious. Ask questions and learn more about the other perspective before you start to go into that fight or flight response of anger. It's also about getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. I intentionally put myself in uncomfortable situations so I can grow from it. This happened a lot pre-COVID, as I love to travel. Traveled all over the world, experiencing different cultures, different foods. I'm willing to try anything when I'm on the road. And it's that sense of curiosity that builds novelty in your brain, and your brains love novelty. So really reinforcing that curiosity. It's also about leaning in and having real conversations with people about what matters most to you and connecting with them about what matters most to them. It's those authentic conversations, those authentic connections that humans thrive on. So when we have this sense of connection, we feel like we belong. We feel like we belong to our workplace. We feel like we belong to our community. And that is a delicious feeling, and a feeling that promotes and encourages health. So really fostering that sense of connection with each individual that you meet. And then finally, having consistency of these actions. I'm willing to repeat myself until I'm bored, and even beyond boredom, in order to reinforce what matters most and indicate to my family, to my friends, to my colleagues, that I'm going to be leading with these 5 C's. I'm going to be demonstrating this star leadership. And when you do this, each of these 5 C's is like a point in the star. And when you lead with star leadership, you start to radiate throughout, and you ignite that compassion with those you're around. That smile that you shared with a stranger, that random act of kindness you did, that spreads. And now that's spread throughout your whole workplace. These tactics can be really helpful as you're trying to transition into practice with confidence.
Cami, earlier you talked a little bit about kind of the signs of stress, or the kind of the warning signs that we may be in a less positive frame of mind. What about the flip side? What kind of signs could help us, each of us, understand kind of when we've found kind of the right balance between making sure that we're caring for ourselves and exercising our own resilience skills, as well as so that we can help others.
So when you, what are those positive signs?
Yeah, what are the positive signs?
Yeah, excellent question. So it's having relaxed posture. It's speaking freely. It's listening with compassion. It's re receiving and giving smiles. It's demonstrating compassion. It's receiving compassion.
So when we're a little more comfortable doing that and be able to focus on it, maybe that's a sign that we're making progress.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks. So a lot of what I heard you talk about was just the impact that each of us can have on the environment around us when we do all of this. And when I think about people who go into the nursing profession, like I said earlier, they're very often very much focused on the needs of others and sometimes have a harder time taking care of themselves. But what I hear you say is just how if it's hard to do that, if it's hard to take steps toward taking care of yourselves, if you can think about the impact that has on the people around you, so on your coworkers and on your patients and on your family, that might give you a little bit, give people who have a hard time with that a little bit more motivation to focus on themselves so that they are able to take care of others.
Absolutely, because it spreads. And we all know this, that if somebody's really crabby and you go in to see the next person and you are really crabby with them, they're likely to get a little crabby too. However, the converse is just as contagious. If I'm really happy and joyous, and that's likely to spread to you, and you're likely to feel a little extra perk in your step. Uh, I know that one of the there's always balance in this, you know. So it's trying to find that right balance of not extreme optimism and positivity that is also quite obnoxious and frankly can become too much of a good thing and loses realism. But staying in that zone of I'm cool, I'm calm, I'm collected, I have the confidence to do this. I'm demonstrating compassion as much as possible. Uh, and I'm trying to practice, because we're all practicing on showing that compassion and doing that, but also maintaining the realism.
Thanks, Cami.
Mm.
So, so, so thank you again, Cami, for joining us today. I always learn a lot anytime I'm around you. So thank you for sharing these tips. That there are some additional resources for anybody who's interested on resiliencysource.org and also on the center's website, which is ruralcenter.org. So we encourage you to check out other webinars in this series just to continue to add tools to your toolbox to help smooth your transition to practice. And we wish you the best of luck to all of our about to be graduates or recent graduates. It's an exciting time, and we wish you the best in your new endeavors. So we're really glad that you joined us. Cami, we're thrilled that you were here. Listeners, participants, we're glad you joined us too, and we wish all of you a wonderful day. So thank
Yes,
you.
thank you so much.